White boy went,
Richard Pryor once made all of America laugh until they could barely breathe, but his true secrets were never brought onto the stage. On the final night of his life in a hospital room, silent as a grave with no applause and no spotlight, left there was only an exhausted man and a blank sheet of paper. Pryor stared at it for a long time, as if weighing a choice: take everything to the grave or shatter every myth before closing his eyes. Then he wrote, not an apology, not a will, but a list of 7 names. 7 black gay actors whom Pryor claimed he had once had relationships with in the shadows. Some were idols, some were soulmates, some were only for a single night, but enough to haunt a lifetime. What sent chills down the spines of those who witnessed it was this: several of the names were far too famous to be fabricated. So who were those 7 men, and what did Pryor sacrifice to keep them silent until his final breath? Sammy Davis Jr., the secret that never made it to the stage. Las Vegas nights have always had a way of making people believe that anything can happen. The neon lights never sleep, the music never fades, and the stories behind the curtain are often more real than anything performed on stage. It was there in the early 1960s that Richard Pryor, then barely in his 20s, poor razor-sharp and desperate for recognition, first shared a stage with the man he admired more than anyone else, Sammy Davis Jr. In his mid-30s, Sammy was already a living legend, the brightest star of the Rat Pack, one of the rare black entertainers to break racial barriers in Hollywood, a man who could sing dance act and hold an entire room breathless. Pryor opened for Sammy in a lavish show just a few minutes under the lights, before yielding the stage to the king of entertainment. But those few minutes were enough for Sammy to see something different in Pryor, a fearless recklessness, an untamed energy that America both craved and feared at the time. Backstage, when the applause had dissolved into clinking glasses, Sammy called Pryor over and patted him on the shoulder, as if they had known each other for years. He spoke about surviving white audiences, about the fear of rejection because of skin color, about having to smile even when trembling inside. Pryor listened like a child receiving lessons in survival. From that night on, a mentor-protege relationship, formed not on paper or through contracts, but in long backstage conversations where 2 black men understood that even a single misstep could make the entire world turn its back on them. But stage lights always conceal dark corners. To the public, Sammy Davis Jr. was the embodiment of elegance, perfectly tailored suits, marriages to beautiful women, a smile timed just right. Within the entertainment world, however, there were whispers that never made it into print. People said Sammy lived 2 lives, one for the cameras and the audience, and another that only began when the doors closed. According to memoirs written years later, Sammy admitted to friends that he liked both men and women, that his hunger for experience pulled him into parties where all boundaries blurred. Pryor, having grown up amid violence, poverty, and abuse, was no stranger to such contradictions. He did not judge. Instead, he saw in Sammy a man trapped between image and instinct, a familiar tragedy. In 1972, during a joint tour, things slipped beyond the safe orbit. After a long night of performing, the backstage area was left with only cigarette smoke and the clink of liquor bottles. Cognac shimmered in the glasses. Sammy, then in his mid-40s, was weary, in the way only those who live their lives under spotlights can be. He spoke about loving in secret, about the fleeting freedom of being himself, even if only for a few hours. Pryor sat across from him in silence, then placed a hand on his mentor's shoulder. "I understand," he said softly. "We only live once." In that moment, the distance between teacher and student vanished. 2 lonely men, each carrying the weight of history and the expectations of an entire community, found a resonance they dared not name. That night needed no vows. It simply opened a relationship both passionate and painfully complicated, existing only in silence. The silence was not born of indifference, but of an unforgiving era. The 1970s offered no mercy. A single rumor could destroy a career. Sammy continued to appear beside his wife, remaining a familiar face on American television. Pryor, meanwhile, plunged into a series of brief marriages, 7 weddings, 5 women, as if trying to prove something to the world. Yet whenever they met again, their eyes said everything. In 1990, at a tribute honoring Sammy's career, Pryor appeared as a guest. Before thousands of spectators, they were simply two legends paying respect to one another. Behind the curtain, a single nod was enough to summon an entire buried history. Close friends whispered about that unusual friendship, but no one dared to confirm anything, because some truths exist only to be kept hidden. Time eventually overcomes all secrets. In 1990, Sammy Davis Jr. was diagnosed with cancer. During one hospital visit, Pryor arrived when Sammy was so weak his voice was barely more than breath. Sammy handed Pryor an old photograph of the two of them in Las Vegas, years earlier, radiant smiles under blazing lights. He whispered, "Keep this secret for me." No explanation. None was needed. Just months later, Sammy died at the age of 64, taking his parallel life into eternal silence. On the day of the burial, Pryor stood motionless before the grave as dusk settled over the cemetery. His trembling fingers traced the letters carved into the marble, as if touching a part of the past that would never be told. In his mind, echoed memories of that long-ago night in Las Vegas, where everything began, and where everything was also forced to end in silence. To Pryor, Sammy was not only the mentor who taught him how to survive on stage. He was proof that some secrets, though never spoken aloud, still shape an entire lifetime. And as Pryor turned and walked away from the grave, perhaps he understood that the list of names he carried in his heart was never merely about romance. It was a map of moments when people were allowed to live as their true selves, if only in the dark. Paul Mooney, a brooding soul and a fateful encounter. If Sammy Davis Jr. was the mentor who brought Richard Pryor onto the big stage, then Paul Mooney was the one who helped him stand firm there. They did not meet under dazzling lights or in luxurious banquet halls, but in far rougher places, small comedy clubs, thick with cigarette smoke. Audiences seated so close to the stage, they could see sweat on a performer's forehead. In the early 1970s, Pryor was beginning to gain attention, yet he was still struggling to find his true voice. Paul Mooney appeared at precisely that moment, sharp, intelligent, and uncompromising. Mooney did not merely write jokes, he wrote anger, irony, and the things Pryor did not dare say out loud. When The Richard Pryor Show aired on NBC in 1977, Mooney became the chief writer, helping shape the blunt, fearless comedic style that turned Pryor into an icon. They wrote together through the night, argued over every word, then burst out laughing like two children who had briefly escaped the outside world. In the eyes of many, they were as close as brothers. But within artistic circles, whispers lingered for years. Paul Mooney, despite having a wife and children and presenting himself as a family man, was long rumored to be secretly gay. His manner of speech, his gestures, his cool distance from women all fed a suspicion no one dared voice openly. Pryor, by contrast, joked about everything, including the forbidden. In one stand-up routine, he once teased Mooney as gay, right on stage. The audience roared with laughter, assuming it was merely a daring punchline. But those behind the curtain understood that Pryor rarely joked without reason. Sometimes laughter is the safest way to speak a dangerous truth. Around 1978, when the two were at the height of their creative partnership, their relationship crossed a line no one was prepared to confront. That night, the writing office was empty. Draft pages lay scattered across the desk glasses of liquor beside the typewriter. Pryor, having just endured the collapse of his third marriage, carried a familiar loneliness that was no less painful for being familiar. Mooney sat across from him, watching Pryor longer than usual. Their conversation drifted from work to the past, from laughter to heavy silences. Mooney finally spoke what he had kept hidden for so long that he felt more than friendship for Pryor. Pryor did not pull away when Mooney moved closer. Two men embraced in the dark, needing no labels, yet unable to pretend it had never happened. It was a moment both passionate and steeped in guilt because they knew that one step further could make everything collapse. After that night, there were no promises, only a simmering tension. They continued to work together, still writing lines that made America laugh and think. But they avoided holding each other's gaze for too long. Mooney began to feel abandoned as Pryor appeared in the press with new women, as if that night had been nothing more than an experiment filed away and forgotten. Pryor, meanwhile, was torn by shame, afraid of losing Mooney, yet equally afraid of what that relationship revealed about himself. The suffocating strain eventually erupted during a rehearsal in 1980. Pryor, tense from mounting pressure and declining health, snapped at Mooney, calling him selfish in front of the crew. Mooney shot back with icy sarcasm. "You always throw people away when you don't need them anymore." No one around them understood what they were really talking about. But between the two men, every word cut like a blade. The true tragedy came later, and far more cruelly. Years afterward, Pryor heard an allegation that nearly destroyed him. Paul Mooney was accused of inappropriate behavior toward Pryor's son, Richard Pryor Jr. When the boy was young, a claim mentioned by a former bodyguard in controversial accounts. The accusation was never fully substantiated, and Mooney consistently denied it. But for Pryor, the mere possibility was enough to turn every good memory into a nightmare. He felt betrayed in the deepest way imaginable, not just as a friend or lover, but as someone who had crossed the most sacred boundary of family. Pryor's anger was no longer a comedic bit. He cut Mooney out of his life by the late 1980s, severing all contact. At one point, in rage and despair, Pryor even spoke of hiring someone to take care of Mooney, an outburst from a man losing control, but one that revealed the depth of his wound. That fateful night, Pryor was alone in his yard. He pulled out old scripts pages once written with Mooney words that had made him believe they would walk the road together to the end. Pryor piled them up and set them on fire. The flames flickered across his face, illuminating tears few had ever seen. He screamed into the night, "Why did you do this to me, Paul?" There was no answer, only ashes rising into the air carrying laughter, friendship, and a kind of love they had never dared to name. When the fire died down, what remained was not just a heap of burned paper, but an emptiness beyond repair. A place where trust, creativity, and a relationship that defied every safe definition had once existed. Paul Mooney went on living, carrying denials and silence. Richard Pryor went on living as well, but he was never the same man again. To Pryor, Mooney was not merely a lost soulmate. He was proof that sometimes the person who understands us best is also the one who can destroy us most completely. And in the list of names Pryor carried to the end of his life, the name Paul Mooney did not stand for a dangerous relationship alone. It was a scar that would never heal where laughter once turned into a deadly line. Paul Winfield, a wordless jazz ballad. Some relationships do not explode, do not make noise, do not leave visible scars, yet they quietly weigh on an entire lifetime. For Richard Pryor, Paul Winfield was exactly that kind of memory. They did not meet at lavish Hollywood parties, but during a tense chapter in American history, when the Black Civil Rights Movement was still burning hot, and every Black artist carried the burden of representation on their shoulders. In the early 1970s, Paul Winfield was already a respected dramatic actor, especially after Sounder 1972, the film that earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor, making him one of the rare Black faces seriously acknowledged by the Academy at the time. Pryor, by contrast, was a storm comedy sharp as a blade, unforgiving, ready to tear apart every convention. They met at a community fundraising event in Los Angeles. Pryor was drawn to the way Winfield spoke calm, thoughtful, commanding attention without raising his voice. Winfield, watching from a distance, was captivated by Pryor's ferocious comedy, which he saw as a form of political resistance. One man fought through silence, the other through laughter. They quickly discovered a rare sense of kinship, not the closeness of people who partied together, but the bond of those who understood that the world would never allow them to live truthfully with ease. Paul Winfield was a master of discretion. Throughout his life, almost no romantic scandal ever appeared in the press. Only years after his death did the public learn that Winfield had shared his life with a same-sex partner for more than 30 years, a relationship kept completely hidden. While alive, Winfield was open with friends, but never spoke plainly to the media about who he truly was. He understood the cost of honesty in a Hollywood still hostile to gay artists, especially Black ones. Pryor knew this, and precisely because Pryor was one of the few who dared to speak forbidden truths, Winfield trusted him in a way he trusted no one else. They began seeing each other more often, not to be seen, but to escape the outside world. Private dinners, cooking together in the quiet of Winfield's kitchen, conversations stretching late into the night about art fear and the necessity of living two parallel lives. Pryor, beneath his wild bravado and serial marriages, was a man painfully sensitive. Winfield saw that. And Pryor in turn found in Winfield a sense of safety he rarely knew. No judgment, no demands, no need to perform. Affection grew in the most natural way, like jazz drifting through a dark room. There were no rushed gestures, no fevered passion, only a deepening closeness. Pryor was drawn to Winfield's intellect and calm. Winfield found in Pryor a fragile soul hidden beneath a thorny exterior. They could sit for hours in the living room, listening to Nat King Cole, the record needle turning, slowly talking about dreams they had never dared to admit. One evening in 1983, after re-watching Sounder, the film that had changed Winfield's life, Pryor suddenly reached for his hand. No explanation. None was needed. In that moment, all questions became irrelevant. The kiss they shared was slow, respectful, like a promise never spoken aloud. But reality always intrudes. Winfield understood better than anyone that he could not trade his career for the truth. He begged Pryor to keep their relationship secret. "We can't let this come out," Winfield said. "I'm not strong enough to lose everything." Pryor understood. He always did. And once again, he accepted life in the shadows. From then on, they met in absolute silence at private homes, in places no one noticed. In public, they were merely casual friends. Winfield even appeared alongside actress Cicely Tyson for a time, serving as a necessary disguise. Pryor continued rushing into other relationships, other marriages, as if forever searching for something to fill the void. Winfield sometimes felt the sting, but he did not blame him. He knew Pryor had never been a man built for stability. Even so, whenever Pryor needed a place to lay down his armor, Winfield was there. Their bond was not loud, but enduring like a smoldering flame, not bright enough to light the way, but warm enough to survive. It was perhaps the least damaging relationship of Pryor's life, and precisely for that reason, the one that left the deepest regret. In 2004, Paul Winfield died of a heart attack at the age of 64. He left the world without ever publicly revealing his true self. At the memorial service, Richard Pryor sat quietly in the back row, his face empty. When the host spoke of Winfield's brilliant career and mentioned his girlfriend Cicely Tyson Pryor, simply lowered his head and offered a faint, sorrowful smile. The smile of someone who knows that some stories will never be told correctly. After the service, when everyone had gone, Pryor returned to the cemetery alone. He placed a white rose, Winfield's favorite flower, on the grave and whispered, "I'm sorry we couldn't live honestly with the world, but you lived honestly in my heart." That was the only time Pryor ever acknowledged his love for Paul Winfield, not before the public, not on stage, but before a grave. To Pryor, Paul's life was a secret, preserved through sacrifice. And as Pryor turned and walked away, he understood that some relationships do not need to be written into history to become eternal. Some loves exist only in silence, and it was that silence Pryor carried with him to his final breath. Luther Vandross, The Ballad That Dare Not Speak. Its name. Some encounters last only a few dozen minutes, yet their echoes follow a person for an entire lifetime. For Richard Pryor, Luther Vandross was such a moment, brief, quiet, and so sad it could hardly be put into words. In 1985, backstage at the Grammy Awards in Los Angeles, buzzed with lights-polished shoes and the scent of expensive perfume, Pryor appeared as the presenter of a comedy category still sharp and commanding, yet already carrying fractures the public could not see. Luther Vandross, then 34, stepped onto the stage and sang "A House Is Not a Home," a performance that stilled the entire room. It was not merely a song, it was a confession sung before millions, even if no one quite knew how to listen to it. When the performance ended, Pryor left his post and walked along the wings. He saw Vandross standing alone in a dark corner, light catching his round, expressive face, his eyes still wet. Pryor needed no introduction. He approached and offered a line that was half joke, half truth. "You sing like that, and even a tough guy like me feels like crying." Vandross laughed the relieved laughter of someone who had just been seen. They drifted away from the noisy crowd with 2 glasses of champagne, standing in a hidden corner like old friends who had unexpectedly found each other again after years apart. Luther Vandross was a living paradox. One of the greatest R&B voices of the 1980s, creator of songs that made millions of women believe he was singing to them alone. And at the same time, a man so private, he nearly vanished the moment he left the stage. He never publicly acknowledged his sexuality while alive, but for those close enough, the truth needed no name. Vandross understood the cost of honesty. He had a massive female fan base, posters covering bedroom walls, love letters arriving every week. He feared that a single admission could make everything collapse: his career, his image, and the fragile bond with the mother he loved deeply. In that hidden corner, Vandross spoke to Pryor in a low voice, as if afraid of hearing himself. He talked about the exhaustion of living a double life of loving only in silence. "I wish I had your courage," Vandross said. Pryor studied him for a long moment. Pryor was a man who had turned shame into public laughter, who had stood on stage and confessed the darkest parts of himself before a crowd. But he also understood that not everyone could or should do the same. "Everyone has their own time, Luther," he replied. "Not advice, just understanding." A server later recalled seeing Pryor and Vandross in a quiet dressing room, the door half closed. There was no commotion, just two men holding each other tightly, as if letting go might cause everything to shatter. Vandross softly sang a few lines of "So Amazing," almost a whisper, his voice trembling, not from technique, but from emotion, long restrained. Pryor felt that shoulder shake, the sign of someone struggling to hold back tears. He held on tighter, saying nothing. In that moment, they were not legends, not icons, not bearers of anyone's expectations. Just two people who had found a safe place, if only for an instant. The kiss they shared was fleeting, so light it could be mistaken for comfort. But it was precisely that gentleness that made it painful. There were no promises, no plans, no future imagined. Both knew this was a moment that existed only to disappear. Pryor, whose life constantly collided with extremes, understood that some connections are born not to last, but to remind us that we are still capable of feeling. After that Grammy night, they never met again. Not out of anger, nor out of shame, simply because each life continued along its own trajectory. Vandross entered the most radiant phase of his career, winning multiple Grammys, selling millions of records, and maintaining silence about his private life, until his death in 2005 at the age of 54. It was not until 2017 that his close friend Patti LaBelle spoke aloud. What many had long suspected, Luther did not dare live openly for fear of hurting his fans and his mother. Pryor died earlier, carrying the secret of that brief night like a carefully folded note in his pocket. Perhaps Luther Vandross never knew that his name was written by Pryor on that final list, not as a great love, but as a sad musical note. That Grammy night, as Vandross stood on stage with the lights shining directly onto his face, Pryor stood in the wings, eyes reddened. He listened to the words, "And I know, and understood that the song was not only about an empty house, but about all the lives that could not be named. Friends said Pryor cried, a rare sight for a man who wore laughter as armor. Luther's voice reached the deepest corner within him, where wordless secrets quietly lived. That was how Luther Vandross entered Richard Pryor's life, without noise, without duration, but deeply enough to remain, like a sad ballad that rises and fades behind the curtain, leaving behind a silence no one else can hear, except the two men who once stood there listening to each other through everything they could not say. Eddie Murphy, A Game of Chase. Under the Spotlight. By the late 1980s, Eddie Murphy was a name that dominated Hollywood. In his early 20s, he had already become the highest-grossing comedian in America, selling out venues everywhere, and being hailed as the future of black comedy. And behind every interview, Murphy always mentioned the same person, Richard Pryor, his greatest idol, an unsurpassable standard. When Harlem Nights 1989 was released, a film Murphy both directed and starred in, inviting Pryor to participate, was seen as the ultimate tribute. Pryor, by then in the early stages of multiple sclerosis and visibly declining in health, still accepted for Murphy's sake. On set, everyone awaited the legendary mentor-protege pairing. Reality was different. Tension crept in day by day. Pryor felt insecure about his fading form. Murphy was youthful and explosive, sometimes unintentionally crossing the line of reverence. The air between them felt like a game of chase. Murphy craving validation, Pryor both proud and quietly envious. The fateful night came amid an intense shooting schedule. Murphy hosted a party at his private mansion, inviting the entire cast and crew. Pryor arrived late, intending to offer congratulations and then leave. But Murphy avoided him throughout the evening, irritating Pryor. Near midnight, as guests thinned out, Murphy finally appeared clearly intoxicated. He invited Pryor into the back garden. Under the dim moonlight by the pool, Murphy suddenly poured out his heart. The pressure of constant comparison, the fear of being looked down on by his idol. Pryor listened, then said something rare. He admitted to feeling envy, but also spoke honestly. Murphy was talented, and he was proud of him. Those words moved Murphy. The distance between two generations abruptly narrowed. Alcohol and emotion swelled. Murphy stepped forward and wrapped Pryor in a tight embrace. Pryor put his arms around him in return. The hug lingered longer than usual. Then Murphy lightly kissed Pryor on the cheek, a gesture of gratitude, but close to the corner of his lips. Pryor froze. For a few seconds they stared at each other. Astonishment, hesitation, and an attraction no one dared to name. Murphy lowered his head, embarrassed. Pryor took his hand and whispered reassurance. The distance closed further, and a fleeting kiss happened fast enough to deny deep enough to be unforgettable. The mentor-protege boundary dissolved in a moment neither had prepared for. The next morning, Pryor left the party early, leaving Murphy dazed. On set, the aftermath was unmistakable. Murphy avoided Pryor's gaze. Pryor maintained a strictly professional distance. At one point, Pryor overheard Murphy confiding to Arsenio Hall that he didn't know what Pryor really thought of him. That unease hung in the air. Pryor remained silent. Silence was how he kept everything from falling apart. They completed Harlem Nights without ever mentioning that night again. After the film each went his own way, Murphy plunged into new projects. Pryor retreated to focus on his health. To the public, they remained mentor and student. Inside, both knew there was a secret that would never be spoken. In 2005, when Pryor passed away, Eddie Murphy attended the funeral as his spiritual successor. In his eulogy, he called Pryor the greatest inspiration, but his voice wavered. That night back home, Murphy sat alone for a long time. He remembered the moonlit garden, the lingering embrace, the nameless kiss. A single tear fell rare for a man who always hid emotion behind laughter. Perhaps the remaining question was not for the public, but for himself. Did that embrace all those years ago hold more than they ever dared to admit? Michael Jackson, the final secret. No one dared to name. Michael Jackson and Richard Pryor seemed like two trajectories that could never intersect. One was America's golden boy with an angelic voice, yet an oddly fragile shyness. The other was a rebel who turned pain into laughter sharp as a blade. And yet, in the spring of 1978, fate placed them side by side on the set of The Wiz the Black, reimagining of The Wizard of Oz. Michael was just over 20, acting in a feature film for the first time, moving cautiously as if afraid of breaking the lights themselves. Pryor was 38, cast as the wizard, seasoned and irreverent, carrying a freedom Michael had never known. By day, they performed before the cameras. By night, the cast gathered for music rehearsals. Pryor saw in Michael a boy in need of protection. Michael, in turn, laughed freely at Pryor's jokes, a rare laugh from a star living under constant pressure. Behind the scenes of The Wiz was where two worlds touched. Pryor behaved like an older brother, teasing Michael to ease his nerves, tossing in bits of humor, so he would perform more naturally. Michael had grown up without a childhood, carrying a lonely innocence. In Pryor, he found a rare bluntness amid a crowd always saying whatever the boss wants to hear. Late at night, when the stage stood empty, they sat on wooden steps, sharing stories not meant for cameras. Michael spoke of a childhood controlled by his father, of beatings, of never being allowed to choose what he loved. Pryor listened. His eyes, darkening, his own memories bore similar fractures. They understood each other more through silence than through words. The climax came on a late spring night. The crew threw a party to celebrate the completion of a major sequence. Michael appeared with a bit of alcohol, rare enough to surprise everyone. He pulled Pryor away from the crowd into an empty dressing room and locked the door. According to an anonymous crew member, they stayed inside for nearly an hour undisturbed. When the door finally opened, Pryor stepped out first. His eyes reddened. Michael followed his head, resting briefly on Pryor's shoulder. No laughter, no questions. Pryor held Michael's hand for a moment, then let go when someone approached. What happened in that room? The question lingered for years. All that is known is this. If one believes the list Pryor later left behind that night may have held a moment that crossed beyond friendship, fragile, fleeting, and difficult to name. Perhaps Michael, curious and lonely, sought warmth. Perhaps Pryor, softened by drink and emotion, responded with a rare gentleness. The next day, everything returned to its proper place. Michael politely called Pryor Uncle Richard and kept his distance. Filming wrapped, and each went his own way. Michael plunged into a radiant solo career, becoming a global superstar. Pryor continued his path in comedy, then gradually confronted illness. They rarely met in private again. From afar, Pryor watched Michael transform before the public. Towering talent entwined with distortion and controversy. He wondered whether the Wiz night had left any echo in Michael, or whether it had been nothing more than a youthful incident. Michael, until his death in 2009, never publicly acknowledged any same-sex relationship. If that moment had been real, it would have been the greatest secret of his life, buried deep alongside many others beneath layers of concealment. In 2005, in his final days, Richard Pryor lay in his hospital bed. His hand was weak but resolute. He wrote the last name into his notebook, Michael J. Not out of fear, but out of emotion. Perhaps he remembered the sincere gaze of that young man before the world turned him into a ghost of himself. Pryor closed the book and exhaled. The burden was set down. Michael Jackson. The final name among the 7 lay there, like a vast question mark, without explanation. And with Pryor's final breath, that secret closed as well, leaving behind a silence longer than any piece of music. A silence where truth and legend merge with no clear boundary left to divide them. The boundary between truth and legend here is frighteningly fragile. Some carried their secrets to the grave. Others are still alive, but chose silence. No one dares to claim that everything is true, yet no one is certain enough to completely deny it either. And perhaps it is precisely this ambiguity that became Richard Pryor's final legacy. The remaining question is for you among those 7 names who truly loved Pryor, and who was merely a moment he could never forget. If you find these behind-the-scenes stories worth reflecting on, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment sharing your perspective. Who knows, the truth may lie within that very debate.
All data, analysis, and commentary in this video are presented based on information available at the time of production. The content is subject to change over time and should not be considered a definitive forecast. There is still so much more to explore: stories of resilience, legacy, and truth. Feel free to dive into some of our top recommended videos now appearing on your screen.